Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Hey guys, it's Jared. This is part 2 of my discussion with Ann Bremner and Evan Berryalt about the Josh and Susan Powell case. Enjoy. I hadn't heard that they are actually appealing the case, and what is their justification for appealing? It's like, honestly, what did you say, Ann, in the I want to say there were like 37 major red flags or some crazy number like that.
Yeah,
I mean, you showed a graphic on that.
You could double that. It was horrendous, the red flags that were ignored. Of course, the biggest, which was no child has ever died in a secure visitation facility in the United States ever. And yet, knowing that Josh killed his wife, remember camping in a snowstorm with a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and she just disappears, and that's the story that we all heard. But the fact that he had killed his wife, there's probable cause to believe he killed his wife. There's a search warrant that's been executed. I mean, that we all know probable cause has to precede execution of a search warrant. Yet they have him alone with those kids. Right after he had been ordered to take a psychosexual evaluation and a polygraph. A polygraph. He doesn't want to take a polygraph when he's the main suspect in his wife's death. And all the other red flags along the way. I mean, we knew that he tortured animals as a kid, that he tried to kill himself, that he pulled a knife on his mom, that he molested a girl by the pool with his brothers. It goes on and on in terms of what was known about Josh Powell. And of course, Stephen's infatuation with Susan, and he didn't seem to mind that. There were just so many things. So we had these red flags, 60 some odd, that we showed to the jury. And then at the end, we put them all together, and you could see them all at once. And it only takes one. Really, it only takes one for the state to be negligent. And there were some 60 odd red flags. And that was very persuasive to the jury. States can't act this way. They can't, when they have children in their care, custody, and control. They can't act this way. Not the way they did with the loss of Charlie and Braden. Those poor little boys. I mean, there's only like a sock left on Charlie after the fire. And they lived for at least 10 minutes, maybe up to 20. And they were conscious the whole time that they were hatcheted to death and burned.
Well, without getting too graphic, I mean, first of all, the crime scene, as you guys were describing the crime scene in West Valley, just their house. I mean, there's blood everywhere, and to me, as you were describing it, it sounded very much like the blood spatter and the blood stain patterns after a stabbing, and
right,
especially for blood to be on the ceiling and other places, it's like I understand there's no body, but even based on that, there's still so much. I don't know if I'd use the word probable cause. I mean, you guys are the attorneys out of it, but what was the justification for not? And a lot of people, and maybe you guys can help with this too.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people say, well, why didn't they just arrest him?
Well, there's 35,000 pages of police reports, and if your listeners and viewers want to, as we offer at CrimeCon, want to access those and help us, find Susan and any other clues to basically look at, her disappearance and search further for her, that would be wonderful. The DA told the police, purportedly, that this is a no-body case, and we don't feel comfortable prosecuting a no-body case. We know there are no-body prosecutions that are successful, all over the country. There's even an individual, he's got a website, I think, called nobody.com, which he basically offers his expertise in investigating and prosecuting these types of cases without a body. So that having been said, that was the decision there. Detective Maxwell, Ellis Maxwell, has taken a lot of heat on this. for not effectuating an arrest. But in my mind, and I've said this many times, there was probable cause. If there's probable cause for a search warrant, there's probable cause for an arrest. They're the same thing. You know, probable cause is probable cause is probable cause. I believe they should have arrested him, and they had ample evidence, including the life insurance, the blood, you know, ceiling, floor. It's her blood in the house, the fan drying the couch, you know, his internet searches, his tall tale about the boys, and the boys' own statements that they witnessed what happened to their mom, and drawing even a picture of their mom in the trunk of the car. Those are just a few of the items that I think supported a probable cause determination for the search warrant and would have for an arrest of Josh Powell for homicide.
Any other thoughts on that, Evan?
Well, I mean, Susan's phone being in the van when he showed back up at the house is a big one for me. You know, some of the emails and correspondence that we actually discussed and talked about at CrimeCon, as far as, I mean, Susan detailed this relationship that was riddled with domestic violence. I mean, all the precursors were there. So you compile all that together. The fact that you have this written out last will and testament that says, if anything happened to me, if I'm missing, there's one person that you should point the finger at. There's one person that did this. It's my husband, Josh Powell. I mean, so you have everything's pointing the finger. And then what does the guy do after his wife disappears? He packs up and moves away.
Yeah, that to me, oh my gosh, talking about a red flag. Let's see. My wife, who I love just interminably, is missing, and I have no idea where she is, but I'm going to pack the house up 2 weeks later and move.
Right.
So I'm not sure who this question should go to, but maybe we'll start with you, Evan. Is why in your mind, why do you think so many women stay in relationships like that? I mean, if Susan knew that she was in enough danger that she would write basically a last will and testament saying, if I disappear, then it's Josh, why wouldn't she just leave? I mean, surely there was enough resources out there. And I live in Utah, and I'm telling you, there are so many people that would have brought her in, helped her get to Seattle, to her parents' house, helped her get, resettle somewhere, just get away from him. Why do they stay in such an abusive relationship like that?
So the way that I'll start this answer, Jared, is one, it's not completely fair for me to answer a question like this as a male, just to start, right? I've never been in the position of a female in a relationship and kind of what that power struggle is like. But I think it's really important to recognize that regardless of whether or why Susan chose not to leave, it's irrelevant in the sense that it's not Susan's obligation to leave, right? The obligation is for someone like Josh not to be engaging in forms of domestic violence, right? And a lot of times we ask that question, well, why didn't they leave? Couldn't they have left? Couldn't they have done that? And that's kind of victimizing Susan, suggesting that she did something wrong. Susan did absolutely nothing wrong. And I can't say.
I hope you don't I mean,
no,
I didn't want to imply that at all, but it's just one of those where, and I understand also being a male and, like my wife and kids, whenever my kids and I get in wrestling matches, the kids are always like, Marla, help me, or, help us, tackle dad. And she's like, no way. I'm not going to get involved with that. He can take all of us. And I think there's a lot of, I don't know what percent, but there's a lot of relationships that are like that, where the male is just such a dominating figure. And I'm sure that the fear that Susan had to be in, and in no way do I ever want to make the impression that anybody other than Josh is responsible for any of this. But at the same time, Susan was a rational, clearly thinking person. And it's just one of those where there's so much available to him. What is it psychologically that he was doing to her that that you think would make her want to or
Yeah,
be scared to leave.
I think psychologically he was using the children against her, and I think that was what she cared about most. Is she was so concerned about those kids, and she wanted what was best for those kids. And you see it in her own writings that Josh would basically threaten her with the children and say that she wasn't going to get the kids. And I think she was so worried that if she did try and leave, that she didn't have the financial resources to fight Josh in any type of custody battle. She was concerned whether people, I think, were going to believe her or whether they were going to believe Josh. And in kind of the power struggle of their relationship, we see it even in the video, the home video that she made, where she's showing all these things that Josh had done, and he had kind of built this psychological control over her. And even when you do have resources and you do have friends and things that want to help you, it's a really difficult choice because you don't know what the future holds. You don't know what that's going to look like. And I think for her, she was so fearful of what that was going to do to her relationship with her sons. But I also think as a woman of faith, she really believed that there was a good person there with Josh. She believed there was a good person. She believed he could change. She believed if she put in enough effort, she could reform this relationship. She could improve upon that. And so I think it was just, for her, really, it was a combination of her own faith and a combination of her overwhelming love for these children that she never left.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, on one hand, on the other hand, it's like, hindsight is always 20/20. And I think all of us, whether it's a football game that, we think we could have done better at, or even, talking about something like this, it's looking back on it. Of course, there's so many red flags that I think that's the natural reaction, is everybody's like, well, why didn't she just leave? Well, but there's obviously millions of relationships like this across the country and across the world, for that matter. And but especially here in the U.S., there's so many safety nets. There's so many opportunities. But at the same time, I think you're right, Evan. I think there's a chance that she could have lost those kids, and I don't think she was willing to I don't think she was willing to risk that.
Right.
What do you think, Anne?
Well, I agree with Evan in your comments, but I also think we have a lot of her journals and other writings, of course, in this case. She was talking about leaving him. She was talking about getting a divorce. She was also saying she thought maybe he had some kind of mental health issue, maybe bipolar disorder, because he changed so much. And so we all know that one of the most dangerous times for a woman in a domestic violence situation is when she leaves, or when an individual leaves. And I think that's a lot of what happened in this case, is that she was getting ready to do that. She had a time limit ultimatum, for him to change his ways. And we know that domestic violence is coercive control. And, he had her controlled in finances, what she could eat, what she could spend. She had to ride a bike to work. I mean, she basically was under his thumb in all ways. And we have information in the police reports that he had a picture of her with a cut lip. Even his own mother said that he had assaulted her in the marriage. And so all of those things, I think came together where she was killed because of domestic violence. But she didn't leave because of domestic violence. She was controlled by him, but especially those children were controlled by him, and she was worried about losing them.
So you said the most dangerous time for a woman is right after she leaves?
When she leaves.
Okay.
The conventional wisdom on these cases, and I used to prosecute these cases, is that the most dangerous time for a woman in a DV situation is when she leaves, or she's going to leave, because that's when things escalate. And so the theory in this case was that's what happened here, because we can tell from her writings and her emails to her friends and everything, and what she told her family, is that she'd had it with him, and she was done. But he figured she was done and basically took her life.
So you're talking about maybe she was packing bags, she was doing something in order to actually have some means, clothes
I
for the
don't.
kids, that kind of thing.
I don't know if
Or
she was. I don't know
it,
if she was that close. I don't think she was that
okay.
close. I think she had just made the indication that that's what she was thinking of doing, telling
Hmm.
him, that an ultimatum perhaps, but not necessarily packing her bags.
Wow. Well, I'm sure there were enough flags in her mind
Mm-hmm.
that she was obviously preparing it, but at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, I just celebrated 30 years of marriage, and I know that with that much invested in there, you don't want to let it go, even with hard times. And I think in the back of
Mm-hmm.
any person's mind, you have to be like, well, there's a chance that I can help this person through this tough
Mm-hmm.
time. This my spouse or kids or whoever, when you have that much of a tie. But
Oh,
I don't know. It's such an interesting dynamic where we're all basically human beings interacting with each other, and sometimes those red flags, especially, it's like you get so close to the forest that you can't see the forest through the trees, and I don't know. I just hope that there's any woman that's listening to us that is in that kind of a relationship, knows that hopefully there are resources that she can reach out to, because of all the cases that I've helped, along with MVAC systems, is that are domestic violence or the sexual assault, those violence against women. Those are, to me, the most damaging to society, as well as
mm-hmm.
the most heartbreaking to me, because in many times, hindsight, of course, they appear, at least, that they're avoidable. So
Oh, you're right. And there are so many resources, but we have to remember that these are cycles of violence, and somebody will come back and apologize, and the perpetrator, and it's all going to be fine. And then it just starts again. And so I really urge all of your listeners and viewers to know that there's a lot of resources out there, and there's always help for victims of domestic violence. It's a very serious crime against families, like you said. It breaks up families. It can lead to homicide, and the cycles just get worse from what I've seen and what the experts say. One cycle, and then the next one's worse, and the next one's worse. We even heard about that in the O.J. Simpson case, that's what happened to Nicole Brown Simpson. So
yeah.
it's important to discuss these things and to take heed.
Yeah.
Well, based on that, Evan, why don't you talk about the Familicide
Sure.
and kind of that cycle, and how like I said, when I was sitting in your presentation, and you were going down that checklist, I was like, oh my gosh. I mean, red flags were going off in my mind all over the place. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, familicide, how it's usually described, at least if you hear it on the news, is family annihilation, because people aren't super familiar with the word familicide, but it's basically an individual that kills their family members. And then you have like filicide would be killing your children. And it's important to note that this is rare. Familicide is a rare occurrence,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a big deal because you hear it in the news when something like that happens. It's almost unthinkable. I think just yesterday I read about a case of a mother who killed her 3 children, and I think she was having a psychotic episode. She killed her 3 children, I think with the assistance of her 16-year-old son. I just read about this, and it's primarily perpetrated by men. I think statistics show that it's usually 85 to 95% are men. And the kind of the primary factors really for familicide is
He had a bankruptcy.
as a society, we kind of have always placed men in this breadwinner role. And there's this expectation that they are going to be in that role and that they are going to perform. And what we see in these situations of familicide is that individual is failing or they're not performing. Josh Powell is a good example. He struggled financially. He had failing businesses. He had a failing realty business. He couldn't really keep a job. And he had a bankruptcy. So you have these situations where you've lost control. That's really the big piece of this, is you lose control. I'll use again Josh Powell's scenario. He's losing control over his marriage. He's losing control of Susan. He's losing control of the finances. Everything is falling apart. So in their mind, they think, all right, what are my options here? Well, it's I take everybody out. And as I indicated at CrimeCon, there's kind of two ways this goes. There's one, an individual that is really trying to harm or punish their family for their failures. There's also the individual who believes these people can't be without me. They can't live without me, and they can't go on. If I'm failing, they're going to fail, so I take them out. And Stephen Supple was an example that I used. Stephen Supple was a banker who was indicted on banking charges, who was clearly going to go to prison. And he ended up killing his 4 adopted children and his wife. And his belief in writings and phone calls after was it was going to bring so much shame to his family, and they couldn't survive this. They couldn't go on without him. So he decided to kill them. And, you know, I think there's an element of something is going on wrong mentally, right? With these individuals, they don't think like you and I. Josh Powell's a good example. Josh was a narcissist, right? So for a narcissist, when things go wrong, it's really bad. They kind of lash out. They react the way Josh did. So when Josh, for example, found out he wasn't going to regain custody of his kids, that he was going to undergo a psychosexual evaluation, that he was going to have this polygraph, his response was to lash out. And I think when Josh killed his kids, it was twofold. It was one, to punish the Coxes and others who opposed him. But I also think in Josh's mind that those boys could not live without him, and that no one could father those children, no one could parent those children other than Josh Powell. So his only option was to kill them. And sadly, you know, it's really hard to analyze these cases because a lot of times the actor ends up killing himself. You know, Stephen Supple, as an example, Stephen Supple, he killed his wife and kids, and then he drove as fast as he could down the freeway and ran into a bollard or some other freeway sign, killing himself. So we don't usually get those answers. So they're difficult to analyze. They're difficult to predict. And Jared, you made a comment about, you know, you see some people and you think, oh gosh, maybe this person fits that role. And, you know, we got to be a little bit careful, because just because somebody has certain traits, it doesn't mean they're going to go and kill their family, but it is something to recognize. And the big one is really domestic violence, because almost all of these cases statistically tend to have some form of domestic violence that existed previously. There are some times where it doesn't happen, but that's the one you really got to look out for. And if you recognize some domestic violence, you know, do everything you can to provide that individual help, whether that's male or female, as Ann indicated. There are plenty of resources out there. And if you can attach to those resources, please do. Or if you have a friend that needs those resources, offer those up.
Well, but when you say domestic violence, I think most people, they look at physical violence. So describe some of the other domestic violence that you're talking about.
Well, as Ann mentioned earlier, so financial, for example. So controlling finances, where you're simply indicating, okay, you can use this card at this time. You can't spend on this. You can't spend on this. I'm going to control the finances, so I have control over that. Just the emotional, right? Calling someone names, putting them down, telling them how to dress, telling them how to behave. Those are other non-physical forms of domestic violence. And those oftentimes end up being the precursors to what does end up becoming physical domestic violence. So there are multiple levels of domestic violence, and it doesn't have to be physical. And that's, you know, that was actually kind of a big issue in our case against the state, is that the state trains all of its personnel, and it has this massive handbook on domestic violence. And it informs its personnel that there does not have to be a hitting act, a kicking act, a physical act of violence, but there's other forms. And those were all existent here in the Josh Powell, Susan Powell case. And yet the state completely ignored those things.
Right.
even when actually, Jared, you made a point about, violence towards women, violence towards mothers. And even the attorney general during the shelter care hearing, which is when the boys were pulled out of Stephen Powell's home, recognized, and he says to the court, he goes, "We don't buy Josh Powell's story about going camping in the middle of the night." And he goes, "This is the worst form of domestic violence that you could ever perpetrate on a child, is harming their mother." So the state started its case on dependency, recognizing that Josh Powell very likely killed his wife. It's the worst form of domestic violence. And yet they continue to give Josh everything he wanted in that case, which ultimately allowed him to kill those two boys.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.